Welcome everyone to Little Jamaica. My name is Clara James and I'm the founder and president of Black Students in or BSD at the Daniels faculty at U of T. Black Students in Design aims to create a community for Black students to de-stress, talk about racial issues in the design industry, and connect with one another. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land that the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We acknowledge all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. Today, this meeting place is still home to many of those Indigenous people and people of African descent from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. Now over to you, Michael Piper and Otto Ojo, to introduce our event.
Thank you, Clara. I'm Michael Piper, Assistant Professor and Director of the Master of Urban Design program here at the Daniels faculty. In the last year or so, we have focused this program on moments of transformation in the Toronto's urban region, with particular attention to spaces of racialized citizens. Now we're pleased to focus on Little Jamaica. To engage this neighborhood, we're offering design studio coursework, hosting outreach activities partnered with the TDSB, excuse me, and are pleased to moderate this event. I'll pass it over to Otto to introduce tonight's guests.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Otto Ojo. I'm a sessional lecturer at Daniels and an architect here in our lovely city of Toronto. We're thrilled to be in conversation today with four guests whose work is focused on Little Jamaica: Romaine Baker, Cheryl Case, Trua Cousins-Wilson, and Samuel Gannon. We encourage everyone to participate in this conversation either by asking questions through the Q&A or comments through the chat. This past November, the City of Toronto announced the Little Jamaica Master Plan in collaboration with J. Pitter Placemaking as part of a broader Cultural Districts program. This announcement follows a year-long public outcry over the closure of Black-owned businesses and concerns about the erasure of Black and Jamaican culture. It resulted from the construction of a major cross-city transit line and subsequent new developments. The city reports the program will honor the indigeneity of the planning area, center the contributions of the Jamaican culture and community, while embracing a pan-Africanism lens that will recognize Black placemaking contributions more broadly, and create place for all Little Jamaican residents, businesses, and organizations to participate in the process. We recognize that the Little Jamaica Master Plan is a response to the ideas and concerns of community members, and are pleased to welcome our four panelists who have amplified their voices through a set of influential reports and design visions. Politicians, including Councillor Josh Matlow, have cited these reports as foundational to political action that is first brought forward in 2020. Our guests continue to do work in Little Jamaica, furthering the interests of business owners and leading initiatives around issues such as business preservation, public space, and affordable housing. This event will explore potential futures for Little Jamaica by asking our panelists to share their contributions to these reports and to reflect on current work. So first, I would like to welcome Romaine Baker. Romaine is a co-founder and acting executive director of Black Urbanism TO, Pluto. He's descendant of many West African peoples by way of Jamaica. He's a musician, student of history, and a believer of pan-Africanism. Welcome, Romaine.
Thanks, Otto, and good evening, everyone. Just bring up my presentation. So, like Otto just introduced, I am the one of the co-founders and acting executive director of Black Urbanism TO. And so, for those who haven't heard of us, we were founded in 2018, and our mandate is to increase the participation of Black people in community development to advance our economic, social interests and cultural interests. And that mandate really came about because of this, the Eglinton Connects planning framework. So, living in the Little Jamaica area, we could see the displacement that was taking place over the years of the construction of the LRT. We could see that businesses are being displaced. We could see that there are barricades blocking them and the accessibility to them by their patrons, and that it wasn't really sustainable, that these businesses were really going to be removed from the Little Jamaica area, and Little Jamaica in essence would go with it. So we knew that something had to be done. There needed to be some type of intervention, and it was kind of elusive to us until we discovered that there was this planning framework called Eglinton Connects. And so as we looked through it, we saw that there was absolutely no recognition or acknowledgement of Little Jamaica, no acknowledgement of its character, no vision for how Little Jamaica would be a part of this reimagined and re-envisioned Eglinton. So that immediately raised, a lot of concerns for us and red flags. And we saw that, the voices and perspectives of, Black residents and business owners were not reflected. And so as we, took a screenshot of the cover of this document and went around to business owners, asking them if they've heard of it, and residents as well, nobody was aware of what this was and what the future looked like, or what the proposed future would look like based on this planning framework. And so we needed to respond. We needed to respond to that. So Black Urbanism TO, we developed a proposal and approached the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit at the City of Toronto, and identified the need to increase the participation of Black residents and business owners, many of whom have been operating their businesses and living in this neighborhood for decades. This neighborhood is very important and instrumental in Black and other migrants coming from the Caribbean and Africa in the 60s and 70s, going through the 80s and to the present time, that this was the neighborhood where people were settling and forming community in their new home here in Canada. So, there was an ecosystem that was developed, providing all of the necessities, really, from entertainment to food, healthcare, and whatever have you, that people were able to create home here in the City of Toronto. And as we have spoken with people from Africa and the Caribbean that are presently living in different areas of the GTA, Eglinton is the common thread. They have family stories there. They have childhood stories there. There's some kind of connection there. And we saw that this connection was definitely at risk. So with the support of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, we recruited the very talented and Tira and Samuel and the rest of his team from OACC, Open Architecture, to conceptualize what this consultation could look like. How we can increase the participation of Black people, many of whom have never engaged in a setting like this before. This rendering that you see here, which I'm sure Tira might bring up in his presentation, is just diagrammatic, but really providing something for community to respond to. If you're familiar with Eglinton in its present state, it is a site of years of neglect. There's obviously the LRT that has had impact on it, but there's clear negligence there, and the basic level of care that we see across the city is absent at this point. So this rendering is an attempt to start that new re-envisioning and reimagining, coming specifically from the Black business owners and the Black residents, so that they can begin to re-envision this space going forward. And this is particularly important because as a response to Eglinton Connects, this report would then provide that voice that was previously absent. So in the report, we covered various topics, and Budo, we had contributions throughout, but in the areas that we held the pen on, one of them was the BIA relations. So Little Jamaica is covered by 3 BIAs and 4 wards. So in terms of governance through the local BIAs and just governance through the city structure, it's very fragmented, right? To have like a unified vision for an area that is essentially has oversight by a number of different individuals. So as we engage with the business owners, these are some of the points that came up in our discussions about the lack of accountability coming from the BIAs. That's pointing to the length of time that BIA chairs have served on their respective boards. There was representation on the boards. They pointed to the lack of representation, which has stemmed from apathy in some respects, because of years of anti-Black racism, which is the following point, but because of the, proposing ideas for a number of years and not having those ideas be taken up and actually implemented. There was governance reform that was being recommended, again, because of the length of term that BIA chairs would be sitting on the boards, and also because as a structure, it really didn't support the interests of business owners, many of whom were tenants. So on the BIA boards, you have representation from landlords and tenants, the property owners and those who are renting from them. And those interests are sometimes not aligned. In fact, I think in very critical areas, they're very unlikely to be. And we have one board, one structure that is supposed to be addressing or appeasing those 2 different groups. So there was definitely, and we completely agreed with the business owners that there were some fundamental issues with the way how the BIA boards are structured. And there was the need for official rebranding. So, on the west side, Eglinton Hill is called Eglinton Hill. On the east side, York Eglinton BIA is called the International Market, and Fairbank Village is over here. And so these areas were, Little Jamaica stems from the west to the east, those boundaries, but there was no official unifying branding to connect to these various neighborhoods. COVID-19 recovery. So we held our consultation in February of 2020. And as we all know, by March, when we were intending to do additional surveying of the business owners, in addition to the 2-part consultation series, the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. So businesses were in complete lockdown. We were all, well, for those of us who could work from home, at home, schools were closed, everything was in utter chaos. But what it did provide, the pandemic, was an opportunity to assess how COVID was impacting this community. So we engaged with a number of organizations that were representing the interests of the Black community at various levels of government. One of them being the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, NAPC, the Black Business and Professional Association, or the BBPA, and the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce. And so we spoke with them about some of the things that they were hearing, and and what would be needed at this time during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it really pointed to the systemic barriers that were pre-existing that had been exacerbated. And so some of the things that we heard from these organizations was that the businesses were asking for direct funding to the businesses. There were a number of different streams that were being used that were where systemic barriers were inherent in them, which prevented businesses from accessing resources. There was need for sustainable financial infrastructure for Black community, and that's in the community services sector. But to address systemic anti-Black racism, just looking at how, particularly the philanthropic sector has underfunded, Black serving and operated organizations relative to other communities, and focus on a sustainable Black ecosystem with sustainable funding sources and emphasis on collaboration across sectors to drive long-term systems change. And so there was definitely consensus that there was an opportunity being provided by COVID to really assess our systems and how they function, and be intentional with how we move forward. So the next section that we held the pen on was the economic development study. So we heard from the businesses about, the barriers to ownership that they were facing. Some of the solutions that were explored included community land trusts and just group economics of how, as a collective, folks could, pull together their resources and, address these barriers. There was a need for an economic development strategy. Just recognizing how far or the extent of the damage that the LRT had created for this neighborhood, and that it really required the onus, and the onus was on government, whether it be the province through Metrolinx or the city, to be able to very comprehensively support this neighborhood so that it can be on a track for growth. Another thing we heard was about the importance of street festivals and other cultural events as economic drivers. So we developed recommendations in response to many of these things that we heard, which you can definitely find in the report. And the last area that we had discussed or held a pen on in the report was on the cultural events. That there was a need to tie Little Jamaica to annual Caravana celebrations, which, if you think about it, made absolutely no sense that connection hasn't been maintained over the years, right? With various festivities being held outside of this neighborhood, which is supposed to be a reflection of the Caribbean and the city, and the need to promote Little Jamaica as a destination for musical events. And that's just pointing to the strong reggae history, the venues that are still there that have been used. Well, I guess they're underused right now because of COVID, but there's a very strong and rich history there for the music scene that Little Jamaica has provided to the city of Toronto. So now I'm going to get into our work that we have continued to do since that report. So we have launched an initiative called the Pathways to Community Ownership, and it builds on the recommendations that we provided, and it came from the business owners around collective community ownership of commercial spaces. And we also worked with the Masters of Planning students at U of T to look at supports for Black-owned small businesses, looked at the impact of transit-oriented development, and different mechanisms that can address the gaps in ownership. So for the Pathways to Community Ownership project, we're looking at CLTs as a model to address this need, and also just group economics, the mechanisms that business owners can use to own property in the area. And so this project, the main deliverables of this project are on creating an economic democracy curriculum, which looks to build awareness around these different community ownership models, and is designed to help the business owners to arrive at a level of readiness so that they can pursue ownership opportunities actively. And there's also, mapping and analysis of the land assets in the neighborhood. So For the Community Land Trust, it is essentially a community-based nonprofit, non-governmental organization aimed at securing long-term affordability and community control over land. For the commercial aspect of it, it refers specifically to the perpetual affordability of commercial ownership and rental opportunities for community-based businesses. So the two models that are well utilized and that we've been looking at, and that is the lease model, in which the CLT will own the land and building, and it will lease out the space to a qualifying business tenant. And so the tenants of the CLT will need to be clearly defined by criteria. In our case, we're looking to perpetuate Little Jamaica as an Afro-Caribbean business district. And so the businesses would need to qualify for that criteria. The benefits of the lease model is that it requires very little upfront investment from the tenants. Leases can be tailored to meet the distinct needs of each tenant. But one of the challenges is that the lease model does not ensure equity building for commercial tenants. The other model is the limited shared equity model. So in a limited shared equity model, a qualifying small business owner purchases the building or space at a more affordable price from the CLT. And that is because the purchase price does not include the cost of the land. They then lease the land underneath the building or space from the CLT in the form of small monthly fees. The benefits include that if and when the owner sells the space, they receive a limited portion of the equity from the sale, as they're required to sell to another qualified buyer. This may allow the businesses to have a larger say in their community, and this is particularly relevant for us as we know that there are barriers as it relates to influence that the Black business owners have had in their respective BIAs. The challenges of this model is that it requires upfront investment from the business owners, and even at a reduced cost, the purchase price may not be deeply affordable. So the main deliverables for this project are: one, the economic democracy curriculum; two, the mapping of the land assets in the neighborhood, and the third is through our partnership with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, we will be delivering workshops on the CLT models and how they can be leveraged for economic, housing, or food sovereignty initiatives in Lawrence Heights, Main and Finch, in Little Jamaica, and Mount Dennis, which is just west of Little Jamaica. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Romain. That was a great presentation and great to see a lot of the work that Blue has done in the past and what you're still doing today with the Little Jamaican neighborhood. So our next panelist will be sharing a little bit of what they've been working on and what they've done in the past with us tonight is Cheryl Case. Cheryl's an early career Canadian urban leader with the School of Cities, an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo, and is founder and principal urban planner of CP Planning, a planning firm that nurtures relationships between the government, charity, private, and community sectors to develop programs that reflect housing as a human right. In partnership with the community, she implemented the Black Futures on Eglinton Community Research Project that is now living through the Tenant Solidarity Program, TSP, where she and the community organized for affordable housing in Little Jamaica, Toronto. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Ojo. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Oh, my hair, sorry. My hair is very flexible. Okay. Okay. All right, if my hair starts sticking up again, please let me know. I'm on camera now though, so I'm watching myself.
Will do.
So yeah, so honored to be here. So I'll be speaking about Little Jamaica and my engagement with the community around community planning for affordable housing. And this is with the lens of applying a human rights approach to planning for housing. So I think before getting into kind of any conversation around human rights and housing and planning engagement, I think it's important to also hopefully because I know there's a lot of youth in the room, and I hope my story can be a bit of an inspiration, right? Like I grew up in Little Jamaica, or in Kipling and Dixon, and I was part of one of the kids that were volunteering on snack program to help deliver snacks to the kids. And I had no idea what planning was and what the development sector actually had to do with housing. I actually just engaged because I was interested in protecting the environment, and finding the connections was very, very useful and interesting to me. And so actually, one of the things I did before graduating from Ryerson University's planning school was research housing, and then actually work on putting that information out there to the public and making it useful. There are times when you believe that you can't do it, that it's really hard. But if you just keep pushing through and finding like-minded people, eventually, hopefully, if you're able to push through all the barriers that are before you, you'll be able to have a voice in shaping the way that communities are planned, right? Because the whole idea of a human rights approach is, having to contend with the fact that the people who are making decisions today don't necessarily have the interest in mind of the people who most would benefit from their services, right? People who are low income. We need advocates and people at the higher levels who can do that work and who have that sympathy for those people. And so really pushing through and trying to carve your own way is a really important part of being able to put housing in focus. And so this is just a little picture of one of the first community programs that I led right after graduating. And I hope it serves to inspire others that, if you push through and work on finding those partnerships, that you also can be part of hopefully leading policy changes in your neighborhoods. And also just wanted to get into what are human rights. I've delivered lectures on this in the past, but I'm going to just leave with this one thing here. So human rights is different than equity. Equity is what we believe as a value, as a subjectable thing, whereas law, the idea with human rights is that there's an objective understanding of human rights, and that is that everyone has a right to affordable housing. And the way that the housing is actually met is through community efforts. I can't go into it now, but it's important to reference that the Ontario Human Rights Code actually is referenced in planning. So that means that planning processes should implement the housing as a human right. However, of course, although it is in law, through practice, many people don't actually believe in this. And so it's not implemented without actually having people in decision-making powers who agree with these rights and seek to confront challenges that prevent access. So now I'm going to get into Black futures in Eglinton. So this was my first engagement in planning in the neighborhood of Little Jamaica. So I launched it in 2019 and it ran for about a year and some change. And again, this story about being small and having to contend with the process. So Black futures on Eglinton came years after the City of Toronto had already finished its own planning process. And so the City of Toronto was able to spend $1.5 million in studies, and they did a lot of really great things, I'm sure, in terms of the area that they were measuring for their success, right? But in looking at their focus of greening, building, and traveling, affordable housing was not a criteria where they were measuring success. And that is very clear in the plans that have been produced and that we're now having to confront in our community process of planning for affordable housing, right? And so again, that being a small bug fighting against the big machine, the city planning budget has not yet gotten to the $1 million stage, but definitely hope and dream that eventually we can get to that stage where we can actually deploy these resources in support of community and community planning. And this community planning process was actually one that was identified in this Little Jamaica study that I conducted in partnership with Black Urbans in Toronto. And this is where we identified to be the Little Jamaica neighborhood. So community partners has always been a really important part of the process. And again, that's having to do with human rights, right? Making sure that the people who are most directly impacted have a voice in setting the agenda. And also are included as economic partners, right? So in terms of Black Urban Toronto, it takes them time to engage in this process, providing them with compensation for their time and their expertise. And then hiring actually local representatives to be part of the community outreach program, so that if I'm proposing ideas, I have someone who can actually sometimes even counter me and say, what, this is not how the community works, right? And someone who does actually know how the community works. So again, here are some of the things that we were contending with and confronting is that in Little Jamaica, over the 10-year period, the population has decreased by about 7% or so. However, the actual income, the value of housing has increased much more, as well as the value of the household incomes. Not targeted in this map here is also the fact that the Black population declined at 3 times the rate of the general population. So that intersection with anti-Black racism is illustrated in part there. So as part of the Black Futures in Eglinton project, the top 2 cultural processes that the community identified as being valuable is investing in community relationships. So actually getting to know your neighbors and knowing, what are their thoughts about the neighborhood and what types of programs do they want to see and what assets do they have in terms of skills or capital resources that can actually be used to help achieve the vision, right? Or even their social network. How could that help to achieve the vision? Investing in those relationships was identified as the #1 priority. And then strategic development and planning. Third comes investing in relationships with the city. So it seemed that the community was really invested in just talking amongst themselves and building that strategic plan for what they envisioned and hoping the city essentially would come on as a partner. And then in terms of cultural objects, street festivals, educational events, arts-based events, protecting heritage buildings, and food festivals were things that were identified. And here's just some quotes. So if you go to cityplanning.ca/BFOE, you can see the full report and just read all the things that were discussed during that study. So I kind of very simply shared with you some of the problems and kind of give you an idea about what the community identified as its priorities. So what are some of the solutions that are in the works to be developed in response to what was described? So immediately, actually, after completing the Black Futures in Eglinton project, we launched the Tenant Solidarity Program. And it was possible to jump from one project to the next because actually the project partner, the Oakwood Vaughan Community Organization, a local resident association active in Little Jamaica, was one of the first attendees of a Black Futures in Eglinton event. And in that event, the purpose of the event was to invite to the community, okay, here is the space, a vessel for you to inquire and to seek my support for what you're working on. And the Oakwood Vaughan Community Organization really wanted support on addressing the affordable housing issue. They've been blowing their whistles on the topic for, they describe, at least 5 years, and they really needed support. And so from that meeting, initial meeting in 2020, I think we had our first event. We worked together over the period of a year and then submitted for funding, and very fortunate to receive funding for this program, Tenant Solidarity Program. So the Tenant Solidarity Program is a broad program, but I'll note that within this program, we also have the Affordable Housing Working Group. And so these are just a couple slides from one of our most recent broader community meeting. And the Affordable Housing Working Group, which is a subsection of the Tenant Solidarity Program, has 3 key objectives. Number 1 is the right to remain. So right now in the city of Toronto, we have the right to return. So if you're displaced from a development, you have a right to return to the unit once it has been redeveloped. But the community identified that actually there's a lot of people that are being pushed out of the neighborhood. So how can we actually allow them to stay in the neighborhood despite whatever market forces may be? 2 is to identify properties where affordable housing could be built, and 3, setting targets for the right level and amount of affordable housing. So that's solution number 1, right? Just the community engaged process, supporting local volunteering on topics, knowledge building within the community, all those things. And so number 2 is implementing this value. And this is the value that policies to increase housing density in single-family dominated neighborhood areas must integrate provisions to generate affordable housing that reflects the interests of marginalized groups who have been systemically excluded from the economy of building, owning, and renting housing in these neighborhoods. Failure to integrate such affordable housing provisions risks renewing the legacy of systemic discrimination. This is the value that I hold very dear, and this is informed by my human rights kind of perspective. And this is one that's very important to note because the City of Toronto currently is looking at increasing density in predominantly residential detached neighborhoods. Oh, so I don't have, sorry, I'm skipping a bunch of slides. I thought I maybe had a picture of the missing middle continuum. So the missing middle continuum is from, let's say, a duplex or backyard laneway suite all the way up to a 4-story apartment. So the city of Toronto currently is about 2/3 of the residential area in the city of Toronto is for detached housing only. So the city is looking at actually expanding the opportunities in those neighborhoods to now include perhaps laneway suites and maybe even 4-story apartments. So as the city looks into this type of policy to actually address the systemic racism that has excluded Black people and other lower income people from these neighborhoods, or other discriminated against people as well, because I definitely have heard stories of Black people looking to buy a house, but then not being allowed to proceed in the process specifically because they're Black, not even because of their income, but just general discrimination. So the city is looking into changing policies in these neighborhoods. They're going to have to also thinking about how to address the long-term impacts of this exclusion. And so the solution is Partner that we've come up with. And so this is I'm trying to go pretty quickly in my presentation, but Partner is looking at partnering up with single-family homeowners to build affordable housing on their properties. And we're very pleased to be partnered with the City of Toronto Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit as well, as they see this as a great opportunity to address the displacement of Black households from neighborhoods. And so essentially the reason why these values of addressing the exclusion and having this kind of partnership approach to increasing housing in the neighborhoods areas is because essentially communities deserve better than this that's happening here. We're seeing a lot of bungalows being demolished and turned into even more luxurious single family houses. Imagine if reconciliation and addressing systemic anti-Black racism was considered in this application. What would the alternative result be? And again, looking at this is just what's happening, right? In the neighborhood of Oakwood Vaughan, you're seeing the city estimates that there's been $3.8 million worth of building permits filed to add a new building, which is essentially a demolish and redevelopment, to add a story, or to do other residential building additions that are similar in scale to improving a single family house for single family house use. And so the third solution that's being looked at is, well, this is not just an issue that exists in Little Jamaica itself, right? The municipal program of planning for transit, but then actually not planning for affordable housing is prevalent across Ontario. And so that's, there is a missing middle thing. There it is, so sorry. Okay. Yeah, so that's why we're working on the network road mapping for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. So actually, this is looking at partnering neighborhoods in Toronto with neighborhoods in Peel and neighborhoods in Ottawa, because if all these groups can work together to actually ensure that whenever there's a provincial investment in transit, there's also a requirement for affordable housing, and also specifically for affordable housing that can get at this systemic racism laden within the programs and processes, then we can really have long-standing impact and change. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. I have a script somewhere that I've misplaced. One second, everybody. There it is. So next we have Tura Cousins-Wilson and Samuel Gannon. Tura is a co-founder of the Studio of Contemporary Architecture, or SOCA, and is a licensed architect in both Ontario and the Netherlands. He holds an undergraduate degree in architecture from Ryerson University and a master's degree in architecture from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Samuel is an intern architect at LGA Architectural Partners in Toronto, a graduate of the University of Waterloo MArch program. During their time at Waterloo, Samuel has volunteered with Open Architecture Collaborative Canada and provided research and writing support to Black Urbanism Toronto and preparing for the report, a Black business conversation for Little Jamaica. Welcome, Tura and Samuel.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen. Tura is going to start here. But Tura, you can just prompt me and I'll advance the slides when you need me to. Oh,
I'm noticing it looks like
did we lose Tura?
might have lost Tura.
I think we might have just lost Tura there.
Oh, he's back.
Oh, good.
Give him a sec while he connects.
Okay. Well, I'll go to the. Hopefully, Tura can jump back in a second.
So
But
I think he's.
Oh. Tura?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what just happened there. Sorry about that.
The Zoom.
I'll go
problem.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Sorry, I was logged out of Zoom somehow accidentally. Just a quick bit about me, and then Samuel can go ahead. So founded the Studio of Contemporary Architecture with the partner Shane Laptis there in the yellow shirt. And what our interest in architecture has been, everything to deal with literally the contemporary condition, which is in part why we named our office that. The second part being SOCA and acknowledging our roots. Shane's from Trinidad and myself from Jamaica, and lovers of soca, mento, reggae, dancehall, you name it. So some of the work that we've been doing has been largely community-based, as whether it's been speculative work in counter-proposal for Alexandra Park, or this St. Lawrence Center, as well as private residential and institutional and sports and recreation. I'll pass it over to you, Samuel, and then I'll jump back in later.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tura. There we go. So yeah, hi everyone. My name's Samuel Gannon, and I use they and them pronouns. Thank you to all the organizers. It's really an honor to be here tonight. So I'm an intern architect at LGA Architectural Partners in Toronto, and I'm here today as a volunteer representing Open Architecture Collaborative Canada. Open Architecture, OACC, is a community of socially minded designers, architects, planners, and creators who strive to create more equitable relationships between communities' quality of life and their built environment. So in 2020, OACC had the privilege of providing support to Black Urbanism Toronto in consulting business owners in the Little Jamaica neighborhood and in producing the report that Romain talked about, Black Business Conversation, Planning for the Future of Black Businesses and Residents on Eglinton Avenue West. So the process of collaborating with Budo and providing support and creating that report, the first and really crucial step was that Budo held one-on-one conversations with business owners, Black business owners in the neighborhood and throughout the process. And that was truly critical for building trust with community members. And Open Architecture Collaborative worked with Budo to host 2 community events for business owners with a follow-up survey and some other allied events. The community events had a twofold purpose: to help make the business owners aware of the city's plans, since they had mostly been left out of the consultations, and then to hear their ideas about challenges and solutions for the neighborhood. So in collaboration with other partner groups, we worked to summarize what we gathered from all the conversations and did further research into issues facing Little Jamaica and case studies on potential solutions. So as part of this, my colleagues from OACC, Mona Day, Elizabeth Ansack, and myself collaborated a lot with Tura from SOCA on an architectural and spatial analysis of the neighborhood, which Tura is going to talk about in a moment. So as Romain and the organizers mentioned, the report was shared with the city and the public, and it's available online. So I think it's just to kind of contextualize our involvement. as Open Architecture Collaborative specifically, I think it's really important to note that our work was to provide support for research and community engagement, as Romain and Dane and their colleagues from Budo had laid the groundwork and built trust through those personal conversations. Just the importance of the work being led by community members and business owners from the neighborhood. Regardless of our intentions, white or non-Black architects or researchers from the outside would often simply perpetuate the cycle of exploitation and anti-Black racism unless we're working in support of the organizing efforts of residents themselves. So just as an example of this, of a lesson learned. Our group from OACC helped Budo facilitate the community engagement events. And we had helped put the slideshow together, and we were speaking at the front of the room near the beginning to help set the context and talk about Eglinton Connects and the city's plans, meaning to help the community members understand what the City of Toronto had planned. We thought that we were summarizing the city's misguided plans so that residents could critique it in an informed way. But what it looked like we were doing was standing in front of a room telling people what was going to happen in their community. And the people in attendance started to speak up and express their entirely justified anger about those plans. And the slideshow kind of had to be thrown out. The conversation had to become an open roundtable right away, with Dane and Romain from Budo speaking from the connections and relationships they had with people in the neighborhood. It kind of just didn't work as like, you know, here's the presentation we're going to make, because even while we were intending to critique what the city was trying to do, we were sort of replicating the pattern of the way the city did things. And it was important to break that down and do things in a different way that worked for the people in the community. So right now, Tura and I want to, focus on some key aspects of the report that relate to architecture and planning, and highlight some of the problems that occur when design professionals create more problems than they solve. So we're going to touch on Toronto's broad-scale planning policy documents, which put Little Jamaica at risk by actively promoting gentrification and Black displacement. And after that, Tura will share our analysis of built form along Eglinton West, along with the architectural rendering of future possibilities that he created based on the feedback and ideas from community members. So as Romain and Cheryl talked about, recent decades have seen Little Jamaica face challenges, including gentrification and displacement, exacerbated by the construction of the Crosstown LRT and now by COVID-19. And the disruption associated with the LRT construction has led to the closure of Black businesses in the neighborhood. Leading up to 2020, recent zoning and planning changes opened the door wide to gentrification and displacement without creating policy or bylaws to sustain or support the growth of Black-owned businesses. In fact, the city's Eglinton Connects plan, which Romain talked about, explicitly endorses gentrification and the displacement of longtime residents. There's a quote where it states that it aims to attract, quote, a new population looking for a high quality of life that is contemporary in its urban vision, end quote. And from when I first read the report, I just found that incredibly striking, how they were actively like, yeah, we want to displace people, we want to gentrify, and just the kind of starkness of that being set out right in the language of the report. So part of the analysis that we did was to map the locations of the Black-owned businesses in the neighborhood. And you can just see on the left 2010 and on the right 2020, since the construction began, 50% of the Black-owned businesses on Eglinton West permanently closed. And there's been no penalty for construction equipment blocking access to storefronts for years at a time, and the completion date kept getting pushed back, and no compensation was being given to businesses impacted. So one of the sections that we put together in the report was linking this to a recurring pattern of structural racism in Canada. Debbie Gordon, who wrote a thesis delving into displacement in Little Jamaica, cites examples of other Black neighborhoods in Canada which experience neglect and purposeful erasure, including Amber Valley in Alberta, the Grange neighborhood here in Toronto, the demolition of Africville in Nova Scotia. That's what these images are from, and Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. And then, as Romain talked about, the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities, and government-mandated closures have not been paired with adequate supports for small businesses. And the provincial policies and city planning documents tend to apply blanket solutions, which can make things much worse at a community scale, as we'll see on the next slide. So I'll hand it over to Tura.
Yeah, thank you. Going to speak to some of the challenges specific to architecture and planning. I think one of the challenges that we found as architects is, and I think, I know many of you are listening are students, is so much of what we have to address are not necessarily architecture or planning issues. And that's what we heard from the community. So things like construction debris on the street, or lack of parking, or why is the construction extended, which was challenging as professionals, where you're trained to learn to kind of solve problems in a certain dimension. Would like to speak to some of the planning principles, and looking at this image, some of the reactions we got from the community, and quite obviously and rightfully, was no reflection of the community, whether in the people, the businesses. This image here is a generic image. It could be Eglinton, it could be Shepherd, it could be Toronto, it could be a new development in Edmonton. And I think part of our critique was, and our role in doing the report, is identifying to say, we can develop community with character. And I think that was one of the criticisms that we had with Eglinton Connects. And, in certain, rightfully so, Eglinton Connects is a master plan vision for a street that spans the entire city, east to west. So, I think it was identifying this, and I think, yeah, you can go to the next slide, of how large Eglinton is. And I think, Eglinton is not the only transit oriented development or transit project in the city. Large transit, there's the Ontario line, there's Finch, there's going to be many more to come. And it's, thinking about the local when we plan large scale infrastructure projects. Little Jamaica isn't the only distinct community on Eglinton. In fact, there's tons of different communities, and depending where you are, whether it's in Scarborough or Yonge and Eglinton, or further west. Next slide. And again, getting to the generic, and this was something that I think as designers we need to be critical about, is, and what we wanted to critique is, beautification is great, bike lanes are great, planting trees are great, but what does that mean if the existing community can no longer appreciate those things or use those things? Next slide. And I think a fundamental thing is our approach to density in this city. Right now, the city proposing this gets into some of the things that Cheryl Case was previously talking about, missing middle, and you can see the outline there, the buildings. The plan for Eglinton West is to densify it, and that follows the city's plan for densifying avenues. Next slide. And I think the challenge is, and you can see this in this map, is to densify avenues, but to leave the neighborhoods the same. And we've spoken a lot about missing middle in relation to creating housing affordability. I think it's also critical to see the importance of missing middle in spreading density, in terms of allowing for cultural variation. And this dichotomy, I think, gets to one of the more potent critiques that we have of the planning process, and it's not just Eglinton West, it's throughout the city, is that our main streets, many of them culturally vibrant, are the only places in the city where we allow for a certain degree of density. So the image on the left is Lanark Avenue, and that's literally 1 block south of Oakwood and Eglinton. So 1 block south of the image on the right, where you have literally bungalows, single family homes that could have another 2 stories added to them. So no density or no change slotted for the broader community, and all the focus is in on streets. And it's a question of beyond Little Jamaica. So it's a question of Chinatown, Little India, and I think I like to compare it to Kensington Market, as I think is a good example. If you propose to redevelop Kensington Market, everyone would know that you'd ruin the cultural integrity of it. To a certain point, that's what is happening on some of our main streets, and not necessarily more density. So part of our focus was identifying what is cultural value in Little Jamaica, and I think it gets to the question of heritage. You could look at these buildings and say there's not much value, say from an architectural perspective than any other building in Toronto, but you could say the same question for buildings in Kensington Market. Many of them are quite dilapidated, but are hubs for culture and catalysts for culture. So for us, it was identifying, areas of value that culturally, and many of those were the typical storefront retail. So the thin lots, 20 to 30 foot wide lots by 100 to 150 feet deep. And that's identified in the green. And there was also identifying, community services. Sometimes when we think about gentrification, it's important to sort of think of the different aspects. And that was something that Romain was getting to, was, not just community land trusts, but, commercial land trusts, of not just thinking about residential aspects. And it was also identifying, areas that might not have, significant cultural value. And I think one of the critiques of our, the approach to avenues is that to create a cohesive avenue where all the buildings are aligned of a certain height. My opinion, Toronto isn't a beautiful city architecturally in a traditional sense, and it isn't a coherent city architecturally. And I think we should challenge the idea that, you can't have a 2-story building next to a tower. And I think this was addressing, there's sites on Eglinton where, maybe you could, instead of having a mid-rise, maybe it's more appropriate to have higher density. And maybe it's more appropriate to spread density. And some of these sections that we were looking at was looking at just this. Does it make sense to demolish prime retail space that we know we're not going to get back? Or does it make sense to then spread density and have incremental density? And I think one of the large challenges with growth in the city, and it's throughout the city, is so much of what made Little Jamaica, Little Italy, Chinatown, is that there was an autonomy for people to kind of just set up shop. It wasn't a top down. There wasn't a cultural district set up. And so much of planning today doesn't allow for spontaneity and urbanism, doesn't allow for autonomy. And I think we need to be thinking about how to have smaller players build in the city. And that's why I think it's great what Budo's been doing with thinking about community land trust, thinking about other ownership models. Because so much of what the model right now is that a developer acquires land and demolishes buildings and builds on a big, large lot. And one building replaces, say, 10 retail storefronts in, for example. Next slide. So when it's thinking about literally, the people that make our cities and the people that make Little Jamaica, Little Jamaica. And it's the barbershops, the restaurants, the record shops, the tailors, etc. I think some people that I've heard push back, and I guess more libertarian urbanists, say that Little Jamaica evolves, Chinatown evolves, Little Italy isn't Little Italy, and I think that there's a truth to that. People aren't buying records in the same sense. as they are as they did in the past, or they're not going to say a tailor. But I think a fundamental difference is cities change, but who has autonomy in how they change? And I think this is a critical element where, in Little Jamaica, that in large part isn't the case through gentrification, and then through the rapid exacerbation of that through the transit line. I think a good example, I keep referring to Kensington Market, which was really when it originated an Irish suburb. The market evolved to what we know today because it was the Jewish market. And I think a difference in that is the Jewish community, by and large, I think it's not to cast a whole umbrella, but by and large, became more integrated into Canadian society and moved up Bathurst Street, as opposed to being forced out. And to a certain degree, that's happening in the Jamaican, West Indian, Caribbean communities. And many people have many stories, and I think it's important to acknowledge our success stories, that you don't need to go to Little Jamaica anymore. So there are success stories of West Indian communities buying a house in Whitby or Ajax. And I think that's important too. Next slide. And this final image, which has been shared a couple times, I'm sure you've seen it previously, was a kind of synthesize some of the thinking of the community and some of the thinking of what makes our main streets. And thinking that, looking at a more incremental approach to growth. And thinking about beautification beyond just gentrification, and having community being autonomous in the creation, development, and prosperity of their community. So thinking anything from, what's the potential of Reggae Lane, to celebrating West Indian, Caribbean music, that you could have speakers set up on the street, that Caravana could happen, working with Black artists, celebrating Black artists, but not also being nostalgic. And I think that's a critical point, is that it's not about Little Jamaica reflecting on the past. It's about thinking about the vibrant future for Little Jamaica and the many communities that are in a similar situation. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tura. Thank you, Samuel. It's amazing. So actually, I feel like we could have kind of endless conversations about so many of these things. And so perhaps to get started though, we'll go to Clara, who's gonna kind of lead us off with a question.
Thank you, Michael. So the first question is, the Black Business Conversation Report and the Black Futures on Eglinton both respond to manifestations of anti-Black racism in Little Jamaica. The Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit from 2017 preceded your reports. And recently, the city announced the Little Jamaica Master Plan and Cultural Districts program in collaboration with placemaker Jay Pitter. What else can city builders do to confront anti-Black racism, and how do we ensure that these efforts last beyond the momentum of present day?
Great question. So I think one way to ensure that the work of today lasts beyond just today is, I'd say that property ownership is so critically important. Right. This could be community property ownership. It could be nonprofit community or property ownership. It could be your family owning property as well, right? Because in the Black community in particular, we are less likely to own, in part because we're less likely to have higher incomes. Also, as I mentioned, like there are Black people who've tried to own property but are discriminated against by the seller. So for all this work that we're doing, I think we really need to make sure that we're acquiring property ownership in one of these three critical ways, so that they can be leveraged for continuing to build on and achieving our vision, right? So right now, maybe I can just leave it there, but that's really, I think that would be a really critical thing, is property ownership. And I would maybe to add on, like, ownership of institutions, right? Like Black Urbs in Toronto is an institution, Black owned, Black operated. City planning also Black owned, Black operated. So in having our own institutions, it allows us to go out, and this could be even, for example, a buddy of mine, he works in the finance sector. He's developing a mortgage, one of these mortgage tools, mutual fund, to help be an investment vehicle to actually build affordable housing in the community, right? That's an institution of itself. And so when we have our own institutions with these types of assets, we can just coordinate amongst ourselves and discuss what are our needs, and then actually being able to actuate and pursue those ends. So those are the two things I'd say.
Thank you.
I think it's a great question. And I guess one question that I have is, like, who are, like, when we say city builders, who are we referring to? Because it's pretty broad. But I think, what additional steps can be taken to confront anti-Black racism are really staying out of the way. Right now there's a lot of momentum, and a lot of that is driven by the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit and its mandate. And we are in the decade, the United Nations decade for people of African descent. So there's a current mandate, there's a motive, there's resources allowing for a lot of the action that we see taking place. But in order for it to be sustainable, we need to stay out of the way so that communities can really do what communities do. Little Jamaica became what it is because of community. And, this is the same system. Like, a lot of the work that we do in terms of, anti-Black racism work is trying to change a system. And when we look at what the system has produced, it's, policy frameworks like Eglinton Connects, right? So I think Black communities in particular, have been silenced for many generations. And I think, in order to confront that and to build sustainability, we can build capacity in communities so that they can exercise agency and really chart the path forward for themselves. We tend to lean on government a little bit too much and expect government to do the thinking and the walking and the talking, when I think, communities are very much capable. They know what they want, they know what doesn't feel right, and it's about supporting them to build capacity so that, for example, in a place like Little Jamaica, there's going to be need for generations to come for community members to really be, shaping what it is and how it changes over time. Not, the city of Toronto.
That's a great response from me. I think you hit it on the head there with regards to staying out of the way, which kind of segues me to the next question here. There've been recent initiatives such as the Afro-Caribbean food market along Edmonton that has been spearheaded by like Lori Biza at the Reggae Lane parking lot. And these initiatives have the potential to redefine our perception of that space. So again, in this instance where we're talking about city builders and who are they and how can they better foster opportunities for initiatives like that, maybe I'll turn the question around and say, how can city builders help the community to build up and recreate more of these kind of initiatives?
So you're asking, like, how could the city support more of these types of initiatives?
That's right.
Yeah. I'd say, like, from my experience, like, because a lot of times these initiatives are going to have to start from the grassroots. And so that means like you're having to provide a ladder of where grassroots organizations can build their capacity to take on larger and larger projects, right? So the City of Toronto, I think, did a really great job when they had their 10-year affordable housing plan, and they gave out, I think, like $500 to maybe $1,200 grants to neighborhood groups to host their own conversations about housing and human rights, or housing in general, whatever kind of edge they wanted to take it in. But that gives the community a group to practice working together amongst a group of them, booking space, booking speakers, or setting up an agenda, having a strategic plan, right? And so I've seen the groups that have done engagements through that have gone on to do more things as well. So just giving them that, like allowing them to practice and feel comfortable and in their own agency, and then having graduating opportunities from there to like, okay, you've handled $5,000, here's $25,000. You've handled $25,000, how about this $50,000 program? And then like accelerating from there, and then like just based off of their performance, like continuing to allow them to invest in themselves. And yeah.
I think that's a great example, Cheryl.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Remy.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great example. In fact, our first engagement that Black Urbanism TO led was through the Housing TO 2020-2030 consultation component of the development of the plan. So it definitely democratizes the process and provides the resources that community organizations need.
I was just going to mention, it's actually a really interesting kind of clash of needs or means. So on one hand, there's, a need to kind of get out of the way, as Romain had mentioned. And then on the other kind of side of the coin, I remember hearing from Lori Baser about the Afro-Caribbean food market and how she got up every morning to, scrub the parking lot to get it ready for the event. And she just kept on saying, if they could just give me a little support. And so I don't know, it's a kind of a difficult question, like on one hand, making space for communities and then making sure they have, the support that they need to do the work that they need to do. And I guess that's kind of what Cheryl, you and Romain are both speaking to. It's a challenge, like to learn how to balance that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think like it's in terms of getting, the city oftentimes is the one saying no, like, no, you can't do that. Right? So the community is making a suggestion, cities, no, you can't do that, right? So getting out of the way in that sense, I think that could help. But then of course, providing the resources to like allow us to explore these conversations. But it's the no that I think, like, why are they saying no to these things? Why are they saying no? Can they instead start saying yes, right? That's how they can get out of the way.
I thought we might follow up with a question for Samuel, maybe on built form. Otto, what do you think about or the heritage preservation in lieu of tour being here?
I think that'd be a great segue into that. Yeah. Samuel, maybe you could speak to this with regards to you'd mentioned about a number of the Black businesses closing along the Eglinton Strip. So with regards to heritage preservation, in the Little Jamaica area, it's been discussed as a possibility for Little Jamaica to become a cultural district, and the idea of protecting individual buildings. So should we seek to preserve existing buildings in the neighborhood, and if so, how do we go about doing that? How do we measure the importance of specific buildings in the neighborhood? But even in addition to that, what might the design of the physical environment participate to the culture of the neighborhood?
That's a really great question, and I'll jump in and start, but I hope others will add to this. So as Tura talked about, like just in looking at the physical kind of urban fabric of Little Jamaica, it's a lot of these two-story buildings that are, by many considered not necessarily architecturally notable. which makes the kind of bricks and mortar heritage designation route difficult. And just like in reading about the history and the neighborhood, and in talking to people from there, it's just striking how the important cultural spaces are the businesses themselves and the relationships that exist within them. And there's some buildings that are kind of anchors. There's some important community centers and things like that. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of a network of the way that people from the neighborhood have talked about it and written about it is that it's a network of relationships and that are formed in these spaces facilitated by the businesses, but not necessarily tied to a significant building. But then the challenge becomes like if the neighborhood is changing and like if the door is left open by policies like Edlit and Connect, or by like the recent I think it's interesting to consider the province's housing affordability task force, which is also advising kind of opening the door to as of right densification. How can that process of change be in any way equitable? How can those important cultural spaces be preserved? And so that I think that's like part of why Turo was talking about like the idea of incremental densification, or like any kind of measures that can allow existing businesses to have a place, whether that's by preserving some of those storefronts, but allowing density to kind of happen around them or in more concentrated areas, or like giving them the first right of rental or space in some of the new storefronts that might be created. But I'm hoping someone else can jump in here.
Shall you want to go?
Well, I guess maybe I'll just say that like one of the things about supporting lower density development and why it's so important for confronting systemic anti-Black racism, as well as systemic racism in general, in terms of the exclusion of racialized people, Indigenous people, immigrants from racial majority countries, from the racial majorities. Is because we've been excluded systemically from participating in the development of housing and higher paying jobs, we're not able to compete with, for example, the Daniels of the world and the Tridells of the world, who can make an application to build a 20-story apartment or 20-story apartment or a 30-story apartment, and oftentimes even, let's say, a 10-story apartment, right? Like, to have the financial capital to do so, it's much more difficult for Black people to have that access, and other racialized communities such as the Indigenous community. So the missing middles are really much more accessible for us. And so the development of housing is a important thing in terms of the end product, the housing itself, but the economy around that is so vital as well, right? So if we want to have Black and racialized people having access to better jobs, the housing development sector is a huge place where they can actually be making a better living for themselves. And it's a huge market. It's not just about planners or people working in the trades. It's finance, it's community engagement, it's so many things. So by allowing for lower density development, it actually opens up the playing field so that we can have more diversity in terms of who's actually shaping our city.
So I can't remember exactly what the question was, but in terms of the heritage, conservation, I think it is one of the components of, ensuring that this neighborhood can really build on its legacy. There might be individual, buildings that have unique stories tied to them. That, why wouldn't we want to, preserve it in some way, whether it be like the building in its entirety or at least the storefront and it can be integrated into a newer building, but ensuring that there's certain character about the streetscape that can be preserved. Because to be honest, I don't know what Eglinton's going to look like, 10, 15 years from now. If it's all glass, all glass doors and glass windows and whatnot. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's going to be hard to, tell those stories when it looks completely removed or detached from what it was. So I think it does have some value. Then it should be used where we can make the case to do so.
Right. It sounds like there's sort of a heavy proponent in terms of understanding the community and trying to seek to understand where they put the value in these buildings. As Samuel had mentioned, it's in the connections that are created, and preserving those connections might mean preserving spaces where those connections can take place, for instance. But speaking about, glass on Eglinton, there's a number of new towers that are coming on the Eglinton Strip that are being built, and these have the potential to redefine the public realm in that space. There's the idea that a lot of these new buildings are creating privately owned public spaces. So with that in mind, what are some of the policies for public space that could be pursued by the city and the neighborhood to kind of mitigate historical hostilities towards Black residents and patrons as the street is built up and the public realm is shaped, is reshaped in this way?
Well, for Little Jamaica in particular, I think there's a distinct sense of place that can really be leveraged as new developments are coming in, and as the public realm gets reshaped. That policies should ensure that there is consultation with community, and that critical questions are being asked about who's using these spaces, what communities are being served in an area that will be defined by a master plan that is based on the culture and heritage like Little Jamaica. I think it would be absolutely essential that the public realm is defined by the culture that it's supposed to be enhancing, right? So as new folks move into a neighborhood, because that's where the tensions usually arise, right? With new people coming in and having biases, not being necessarily having exposure to people of different cultures and whatnot, and automatically viewing them as a threat. That is, I think it's essential that, whoever's moving into the neighborhood know exactly where they're moving to. That if this neighborhood is Little Jamaica. And I say that because I had a friend of mine who had moved from a small town somewhere in Ontario. She came here to the city and she lived on the Danforth, and she absolutely loved everything that the Danforth had to offer. The Greek culture that was represented there, and her access to all these different things. And, it really had a distinct sense of place, and she knew what she was getting into when she moved there. And so that same thing needs to happen for this neighborhood, that once people are coming here to this new cultural district in the city of Toronto, that, seeing a Black person walking down the street is not something that is out of place, that exactly where you are, and that the public spaces are conducive to the uses of that community. For example, not saying that Little Jamaica needs to be a place that's exclusive to Black people. Absolutely not. But if we are trying to create a space that is reflective of the culture and heritage, then it needs to be really intentional. We need to definitely be consulting with communities and ensure that spaces are accessible to them as well, because a lot of these buildings are going to have on the ground floor spaces for potential that could be accessible to communities for various programming and whatnot. So it needs to not be a foreign idea that you know, Black communities will be living and accessing various programming and services in the space.
Amazing, thank you. So we have a question from Erica Allen Kim, and they say Samuel's anecdote about community engagement raises an important question about the role of designers or experts. What can be the role of design in this complex web of interactions? If it's problematic, that the BIA is composed of both property owners and businesses, is the solution to increase pathways to ownership, or is there a way to move beyond this capitalistic framework? What are other models of equity can this research support?
Might be a good one for the architect, I guess, to respond to. I don't know. Samuel?
Well, I can maybe respond to the first part, just in terms of the role of designers or experts in this web of interactions, as Erica phrased it. I think like one of the things that we were learning is that, I don't know, I think designers can be interpreters. I think that designers can be kind of helping to translate for people who don't have the training and the knowledge and the language to kind of integrate where they are in this complex web of systems. And so I think, like, as I think Romain and others said, like people know what their community needs in a lot of ways. They see what the problems are. They see when solutions proposed are not good. And so I think, like, being translators and facilitators to help empower people to be able to make their critiques and their visions actionable, I think that's a key role. And then maybe Romain can speak to the question about pathways to ownership and moving beyond the capitalistic framework, the BIAs.
Absolutely. I think I did something wrong with this window. Ever since I upgraded to Windows 12 or whatever version of Windows this is, the computer is a disaster. So I can't really see anybody right now. Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're unmuted. We can see you and hear you.
So about the BIAs, I think we do need to take like a very critical look at, you know, how the structure that currently exists allow ideas to translate into action, how decisions are made. I think those two approaches that were mentioned in the question are possibilities. One was about increasing property ownership. So I think that is definitely one way. And the other could be just, you know, just reforming that whole model altogether so that, you know, the people who are operating businesses, who are paying into, you know, the levies that support the BIAs, that they are, you know, adequately supported to, you know, have a voice that translates into action. As we spoke with business owners, there was a perception that their voice wouldn't result in anything because they're just tenants. And I think even just the perception alone was a barrier. And so I think that the whole structure needs to be evaluated and completely revamped, because it doesn't allow for you know, democracy to really play its role.
So it looks like we're about 8 o'clock, and what better way to end than by kind of taking down the system. So thanks, Romain, for nudging us in that direction. And let me just say thank you so much to everyone. I think, I'm sure everyone as well as I really enjoyed your presentation. So Romain, Cheryl, Samuel, and Tura, who's not here anymore, thank you so much. And we hope that you all will be joining us for our next events. And so I have a little bit to read about that, and then we'll say goodnight. So the final public events and the Daniels Faculty Winter 2022 Public Program happens this week. We have all shared a theme. We have a shared theme of community engagements, local and international. The next 2 events include Reimagining Chinatown, speculative fiction, stories from Toronto's Chinatowns in 2050, coming up this Thursday, April 7th at 6:30 p.m. And Design for Resilient Communities International Symposium on this Friday, April 8th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So once again, thanks to our panelists and to everyone tonight joining us, and we hope to see you again online soon. Thanks and good evening.